I'm very excited to tell you 3 stories, and they're 3 stories about 3 places. 3 places that have shaped the way I think, have shaped my aspirations, have shaped the way I think about cities, and have shaped what I do every day as a city planner. The first place doesn't really have a name, and in planning worlds, we like to name things, we like to brand things, we like to give things an identity. But the first place, which is a place where I grew up, isn't really urban, not really suburban, kind of the edge of a city, in transition. I grew up on a half-acre lot. There was a farmer's field across the street, a very long driveway that was an absolute nightmare to shovel whenever it snowed. There were narrow, winding sidewalks across the street along this farmer's field. They were not the concrete type that have been printed with a date, but rather little patches of asphalt that are discontinuous and bumpy along various points. But this place was a place that I was deeply connected to as a child. And I was deeply connected to this place because I had the opportunity to be free. I had the opportunity to get on my bike and to travel for kilometers and kilometers to the local neighborhood pool. I had the opportunity in this place to get on my bike and to travel for kilometers and kilometers at a time to visit my friends. I had the opportunity in this place to hop on my bike and within just a few minutes' time go horseback riding in those fields across the street or down the way. This was a place where there was a tremendous amount of freedom, and for me as a kid with a bike, I had a lot of choice. Now, there was a challenge in this place for people or children that didn't in fact have a bike, because the distances were just so that a bike was required to do anything that you wanted to do. In this place where I grew up, it wasn't necessary to go to summer camp. We didn't need a program for everyday life. All you needed was a bike, a tree, and a few friends, and you had the freedom to explore surroundings and to explore your environment. In this place, I had a really deep connectedness to my neighbors and my friends who lived down the street. I had a connection to those farmer fields because I skated on them in the winter, and we played in the tree line in the summer. This was a place where it was possible to feel that I belonged, and it was a place where I had all kinds of choices as a child. In fact, at a pretty young age, I saw on a signpost an advertisement for delivering newspapers. And I thought, well, I could upgrade my bike if I got a paper route. And I began to realize my aspirations, and I became extremely entrepreneurial, and I embraced not only one paper route, but at the end of my first year had 3 paper routes, delivering over 150 newspapers, meaning that I was rarely home before dark. What an incredible freedom if we think in the context of children today in cities. Children today having choices to know their way around their neighborhood streets, to know their neighbors. I knew all my neighbors by name because I knocked on their door once a week and collected $1.25 from each one of them. It was an incredible opportunity to be connected through work, through play, and as I moved around on that bike. That's the first place that shaped a little bit of who I have become and my aspirations around being a city planner. Now, flip forward many years later in the future, I'm now living in Etobicoke, in a real suburb, a planned suburb, where the streets are curvilinear and there's a gracious golf course, and nice, wide roads. So you can drive absolutely anywhere. And in this place, I have the great pleasure of living in a basement apartment because I was a student. I also did not have a car in this place. So very quickly, I became acquainted with what today I would call the long commute. I spent hours and hours commuting on the bus straight up Islington Avenue and along Finch to get to York University. In this place, I learned all about the relationship between different uses. And the catch-22 that we have in our cities and in our neighborhoods when we separate the uses that we need as a part of everyday life. Because the uses were so separate in this suburb that there was very little that I could do within walking distance of home. There was very little that I could do without a pretty long bike ride. And it was, in fact, impossible from where I was to cycle up to York University. A few years later, still living in this basement apartment, I started to cycle down into the financial district when I had my first job. It took about an hour and 15 minutes on a good day. And it was a long but a pleasant commute. It was also a bit of a dangerous commute because some of the infrastructure, cycling lanes that you would need in order to feel safe cycling in your suit didn't exist at that time. There's a lot more now today. Now, this experience in the suburbs, this experience of the long commute led me to my third story, the third place where I lived. And this place is in Roncesvalles. Now, in part it was precisely because of that long commute that I had an aspiration to live in a place that didn't have a long commute, that allowed me to do a whole variety of things within walking distance of home. Now there was, of course, a catch-22, which was, where was I going to live? Could I afford a house? And at that time, my husband and I came up with a rather brilliant idea, which was to buy a house and to rent most of that house out. And that's precisely what we did. We spent a very long time looking at houses, pounding the pavement. Now this is 15 years ago in Roncesvalles. It's not quite what Roncesvalles is today. But we pounded the pavement. Many of the houses in the neighborhood were divided up into multiple units, which was precisely what we were looking for. And after hunting and sweating about the price and worrying about what we could afford, we finally found a place that had an upstairs unit, a main floor unit, and the possibility of creating a basement apartment. And this house was on Sunnyside Avenue. So we began to negotiate for this house. And there was a delta of about $10,000 between what the owner of the house wanted and what we were prepared to pay. And at that moment in our lives, $10,000 seemed like an inconceivable amount of money. However, we decided that we wouldn't buy a latte, maybe ever again, in order to bridge that delta and to buy this house. So we bought this house on Sunnyside Avenue, and it became our home. And this was the beginning, for the first time for me in my life, of living in a real neighborhood, in a place where I had a real sense of connectedness to my community, where I could do a whole variety of things, including working right in my very neighborhood. This was a place where my first child would be born, right in my home. This was the place where I would begin to understand the relationship between getting just enough density to allow for the vibrancy of walkable main streets, combined with creating places that have the parks and public spaces, the waterfront, that actually make that density a very livable environment. Now, when we moved into this house, our neighbors came out, said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." And then they said, "Wow, you really misunderstood this neighborhood. You spent way too much money on this house. This was 15 years ago in Roncesvalles. Well, I can tell you, we didn't. We were at the beginning of a curve, and Roncesvalles has since become an incredibly desirable place to live and has continued to thrive as a place that has a whole mixture of housing types. There's rental, there's ownership, there's some new density being gently added on key corridors, enhancing the vibrancy of the community moving forward. Well, after we lived in this community for some time, we realized that it was, in fact, time to start dreaming about living in a bit of a different way in the city. Now, my husband grew up in Etobicoke, and for him, moving into Midtown, Yonge and Eglinton, was like moving right into the heart of the city. So we decided to make the leap and to move into Yonge and Eglinton, and this was really about trying something new. We were going to live on a subway line. We were going to buy, in fact, a smaller house with a little less space, but pay more for it, to have that opportunity to be on the subway and to be within just 8 kilometers of the downtown core. We went forward with this plan. I was a little bit hesitant in doing so. And I was hesitant because I'd really fallen in love with my neighborhood. Not only my neighborhood, but my neighbors. And the night before we were to leave our neighborhood, I couldn't sleep. And it wasn't simply because of the screeching streetcars, because I'd gotten used to them at that point. I couldn't sleep, and I got up at about 10 o'clock at night, and I went out to walk. And I began to trace the steps, the memories of the 5 years that we lived in Roncesvalles. I walked out to Hyde Park, where I trained for my very first marathon. I walked up the hill where I had done repetitions on the hill as part of that training. I walked the route that I used to walk my daughter to where her daycare was, along Wright Avenue. I walked that walk, and I remembered those beautiful years of my daughter as a toddler at my side on her tricycle. I also walked up Roncesvalles to River, a restaurant that we had started as an employment training program for at-risk youth. And I stood outside River for a very long time. And I thought about all the meals we'd eaten there. I thought about all the young people who had gone through those doors. I also went for a walk to retrace the steps, the 10 kilometers that I walked the day my daughter was born when I was in labor. I wasn't going to sit in the house. I went out and I walked 10 kilometers, weaving through the entire neighborhood, and I retraced those same steps. I walked down the street by various friends' houses, and I stopped, and I remembered New Year's Eve parties. I remembered Halloweens where kids tripped and ripped their costumes or where the rain poured down. I remembered all of it as I walked through that neighborhood. And as I was remembering, I was holding on, but I was also crying because I realized that when we get our city building right, we fulfill our greatest aspiration. And our greatest aspiration, I believe, is to be connected to one another, to a place. And I found that in my very first real home in Roncesvalles. Thank you.